Hello, schools in Los Angeles Unified School District, my home district. It is great to see you. There are schools from all over the country today. There is a high school from Northern California joining in. Hello, high school from Northern California. There is a bunch of classrooms from Horizonte Heights in Texas. Welcome, Horizonte Heights in Texas. A lot of teachers from the UCLA Lab School. That's my home court. I'm so glad that you are here. For those of you who are new, my name is Antonio Sacre, and I am a storyteller and a children's book author. And every month, I offer these monthly sort of mini storytelling performances for classrooms around the country for free. I do 20 minutes of stories. I try to make them for all ages. So as you know, today, there's going to be a high school listening. There's going to be a preschool listening. So I try to make it sure that it fits all ages. At the end, I'm going to do a little 5-minute mini lesson. This is sort of little things to think about after my storytelling that you can take into the classroom after you watch this, if you're watching it live. If you're watching it on the recording, YouTube, because we make this available as a YouTube link afterwards, you can still use those as story starters. If you are here joining me live a few days before Cinco de Mayo, you get a chance to put questions in the chat. So I'm going to tell stories for about 20 minutes. I'm going to do about a 5-minute mini lesson. And the last 5 minutes are going to be questions in the chat from any student or teacher. So teachers, you can start sort of thinking about that. My wonderful producer, Rachel Myers, is on the chat. She'll be monitoring that for me. And as we go along, I'll tell you a couple more things. But very soon, el Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May, is going to be celebrated in Mexico and in the United States. You'll know it's being celebrated in the United States for all of the commercials for beer. Nobody should drink beer, but they're using Cinco de Mayo in the United States to sell different things, to sell food, guacamole and tortillas and tacos and amazing food. But in Mexico, it is a celebration of La Batalla de Puebla, a massive, very important battle in the Mexican struggle for independence against France. And if you are near a library or you go to a library, you can go to your librarian and say, please give me information about La Batalla de Puebla, the Battle of Puebla. It's an amazing story. And it's a story that as you get older, you should know about. La Batalla de Puebla. Cinco de Mayo is not just about celebrating Mexican culture in the United States. It's about recognizing and remembering some of the history in Mexico. Well, those of you who know me know that my father is from Cuba and my mom is from Boston. She has family from Ireland. And so I have these two cultures, this Cuban culture and this Boston Irish American culture. I was raised in Delaware. Very few people have ever been to Delaware. It is a tiny state. It's that big. And there's only 5 or 6 people that can fit in a state that small. I'm exaggerating, but I grew up in Delaware in the 1970s and 1980s. And as a kid, I was exposed to 3 major cultures. My mom's Boston Irish culture, my dad's Cuban American culture. He was from Cuba, but we were also a bunch of Cubans in Miami. And then the culture of the suburbs of Delaware in the 1970s. In Miami, I was exposed to a lot of cultures from the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Haiti, that sort of Caribbean culture. In Boston, I was exposed to sort of the European culture, the English, Wales, Scottish, Irish, people from France. But I was never exposed to the Mexican culture or the Central American culture as a kid. It was not part of my upbringing. I didn't celebrate Cinco de Mayo. I didn't know about La Batalla de Puebla. I knew very little about Mexico. I knew it was a country very close to the United States. Young kids, if you can find America on a map, you can find Mexico on a map because there's a bunch of states on the southwest corner of the United States that share a border with Mexico. Mexico is also up against the Caribbean. And so they share this Caribbean Sea with Florida and Louisiana and Cuba as well. Later on today, you might look on a map of the world and find Mexico. Well, when I moved to Chicago to pursue a career in storytelling and to study at Northwestern University, I met a bunch of people from Mexico. And the thing that I loved about meeting people from Mexico was the food they introduced me to. I was very old when I had my very first taco. I'm sure a bunch of you have had tacos. This is something that now is nearly ubiquitous in the United States, but I had a real taco at La Pasadita on Division Street in Chicago. I had real beautiful food there. And then my friends from Mexico began to tell me stories about Mexico, so much so that I wanted to visit Mexico. Today, I'm going to tell you 5 stories from my 15 trips to Mexico. I have been to Mexico more times than I've been to any other country except for the country that I live in, the United States. And I want to take you on a geographic tour of one of the most amazing countries in the world, Los Estados Unidos de México, the United States of Mexico. There are over 30 states in Mexico, and each state is as different as the states we have in the United States. If you live in the United States, you know the difference between Texas and Massachusetts. You know the difference between California and Nevada. You know the difference between Hawaii and Alaska. Well, in Mexico, the differences between the 30-some states are almost as dramatic. There are states in Mexico that are nothing but desert for miles. There are states in Mexico that have some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. Las playas de Baja de California del Sur, the playas of Acapulco, Cancun, Isla Mujeres. There are islands in Mexico. There are volcanoes in Mexico. There are some of the biggest cities in the world in Mexico. And my very first trip to Mexico was to DF, the capital of Mexico, Mexico City, El Distrito Federal. And when I got off the plane, the very first thing I did was go to a hotel and sleep because I was tired. And then the next day, I went to probably the most famous spot in all of DF, Los Pirámides de Teotihuacan. When I was a kid growing up, I didn't know that there were pyramids in Mexico. I hope this is a silly question. Did you know that there are pyramids in Mexico? I grew up knowing that there were pyramids in Egypt. I knew about the pyramids in Egypt, but pyramids in Mexico, so close to the United States, just outside of one of the biggest cities in the world, Mexico City, are 2 huge pyramids, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. The place is called, in the Aztec language, Teotihuacan. You might translate in English as the place that the gods built, because they seemed to have been built by the gods. You can see pictures of Teotihuacan, and I don't think if you're in 1st grade, you can spell Teotihuacan. I don't think if you're in 8th grade, you can spell Teotihuacan. I don't think if you're in high school, you can spell Teotihuacan. For me, I have a hard time spelling it. If you just Google pyramids in Mexico City, you'll see images of these 2 amazing places. Connecting the 2 pyramids is La Avenida de los Muertos, the Avenue of the Dead. And if you go there with an archaeologist, which is what I did, she will show you on the walls the stories from the Aztecs when they came to Mexico and the people that were there even before. And there are stories of how the sun was made. They say that the sun was made by making that pyramid, climbing to the top of it, and throwing a massive bonfire into the sky. How did that happen? Magical myth-making abilities. The moon was created on that small pyramid of the moon. Some strong god climbed to the top of that moon and the pyramid and threw it into the sky. And connecting these 2 amazing pyramids are stories that archaeologists have been uncovering forever. And they've been writing stories about what they have discovered. So that was my introduction to Mexico. The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, where I could see people believed that that's where the sun was created. That pyramid is so big. Back then, you were allowed to climb on top of it, and it was a bunch of stairs to get all the way to the top. My legs were wobbling, and I could look out over the whole valley, ringed by those massive mountains. It's amazing. Someday, I hope you can get to Mexico City and to see those pyramids. After coming down from the pyramids, I went and had food on the street in Mexico. Elotes. Who's ever had elote? Elote is a corn on the cob. We have that in the United States, but you can have it shaved off into a cup, covered in lime and chile and a special cheese and salt, and you mix it together, and it is the most delicious thing. Next to the elote man was well, I guess you would just say French fry lady, but that's not what they called it. She was shaving little thin pieces of potato into boiling oil and pull them out with tongs, salted, fresh fried potatoes on the street. So Mexico City is an amazing place. Then I got on a bus. Does anyone know what a bus is? I got on a bus and I traveled 16 hours from Mexico City to Oaxaca. You can get there faster on a plane or in a car, but I took a bus because it cost about $14. I saved money traveling by bus from DF, Mexico City, to Oaxaca. Oaxaca is as different from Mexico City as Hawaii is from Alaska. Mexico City is full of gleaming buildings, and Oaxaca is full of beautiful adobe and beautiful architecture and a beautiful zócalo and these ancient ruins that you can explore. Oaxaca is where I first ate mole. Who knows what mole is? If you have family that makes mole, congratulations, you are a lucky kid. If you are near a restaurant that says mole, congratulations, you're a lucky kid. Mole is made with chocolate and 50 other spices, and you mix it together and put it on anything, and it is delicious. And in Oaxaca, I have to say, the mole is 50,000 million times better than the mole in the United States. From Oaxaca, I took another bus back to Mexico City, and then I ended up in Guanajuato. Guanajuato is the birthplace of the Mexican Revolution. In the United States, we have Philadelphia and Boston, the sort of birthplace of the American Revolution. Well, the birthplace of the Mexican Revolution is Guanajuato. And that place is full of stories. When you get to Guanajuato, there are small little streets that go up into the hills. There are buildings that lean into each other. There are estudiantiles. There are roving bands of musicians dressed in flowery costumes and big hats and little tiny guitars and big guitars. And they will sing you the history of Mexico. If you are lucky enough to speak Spanish, you will hear it sung by these beautiful men and women singing these songs. And if you go a little bit farther, you'll find mariachis. Oh, the mariachis, their uniforms are even more expressive, and they have silver buckles and bells going down their legs, and they will sing you songs that will break your heart, songs that will make you fall in love, songs that will make you realize that Mexico is one of the most magical places in the whole world. When I traveled along following one of these estudiantiles, this music band, they stopped by a house on one side of the street and another house on the other, and the balconies were this close. And they sang a song, El Callejón del Beso, the place where a man and a woman fell in love and leaned over the balcony and they smooched. Ah, the crowd said, a man and a woman leaning over that balcony, and they smooched. Ah, but then the band kept playing. Oh, but they should not have fallen in love. Why should they have not fallen in love? Oh, because their parents didn't like each other. Why does that matter? The dad said the boy could never see the girl, and the other mom said the girl could never see the boy. Oh no, what's going to happen? Oh no, they continued to smooch even though their parents said they couldn't. And then tragedy. They were never allowed to see each other again. Oh, oh. And we were there laughing and crying, hearing about El Callejón del Beso, the little valley where those lovers were thwarted. And somebody said, it sounds like the Romeo and Juliet story. And the guy said, no, it's El Callejón del Beso. A little bit further up Guanajuato through the hills, you can see a replica of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Oh, and that is a story that if you go to the library, you will hear how she became the patron saint of Mexico. Why almost every Mexican restaurant or Mexican place of business that you'll go to in Mexico or here in the United States, you will see a picture of La Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe. And if you read the story about why, you'll know why that's the case. Not too far from Guanajuato is a not very spectacular hill. And somebody looked at that hill and said, oh, El Cerro de Toliman, the hill of Toliman. Who's Toliman? I asked. We don't know. It turns out that in the Cerro of Toliman, there is a tunnel. The tunnel is almost impossible to find. And every year in the springtime, around now in May, boys and girls will travel up that hill and they'll search for that tunnel. And they don't find it, but it's a nice hike up the Cerro of Toliman. They can turn around and see the beautiful hills of Guanajuato. They can see the plains. They can see their way almost down to Durango, almost down to Michoacan, and they can sit there and have a wonderful day. Well, it turns out that long ago, two boys went up the hill and they found the tunnel. They got into that secret tunnel and they started walking down, down, down. They were walking down, down, down. They were walking down, down, down. It turns out underneath those hills in Guanajuato, there used to be a lot of silver. A lot of precious metals, and these boys were going to find it. And sure enough, they got to a room that wasn't full of silver. It was full of gold. And it wasn't gold from the ore of gold. It was gold treasure. Like 1,000 pirates had put 1,000 ships of stolen treasure in this massive room. And those two boys said, yes. But they probably said, which means yes. And they started to scoop up that gold. They put it into their pockets. They put it into their bags. They carried as much gold as they could. And there was no way they were going to get all of that gold. But they had a plan. They said, oh, we'll come back every single day and we'll scoop out this gold and we'll share it with all of our family and all of our friends. And there'll still be more for us and we will be rich. And they said, yes. But they probably said it in Spanish. Sí. And as they scooped up all that gold, they turned around and they walked up, up, up through that tunnel under that hill. They walked up, 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 and they got to where the tunnel was supposed to exit, and blocking their way was a stone. Somebody had rolled a stone blocking their exit. Luckily, one of them had a flashlight, and they looked and they tried to find a way to move that stone, but they couldn't, and they're pounding and they're yelling, but nobody could hear them. And the one boy said to the other, vamos a morir aquí. We're going to die in the tunnel under El Cerro de Toliman. And the other boy said, no, we're not. We're going to get out. And as he shined his flashlight, he saw carved above the entrance, todo o nada. All of it or none of it. And the boy said, oh, we have to take all of the treasure or we have to leave all of it. And the other boy said, there's no way we're going to take all of this treasure. It's too much. And the boy said, I guess we have to leave it. So they emptied out their pockets. They dumped out their backpacks. They threw out all that gold and they waited for that stone to move away. And it didn't. todo o nada. And the boy said, uh-oh. And the other boy said, oh. They left all of it. And the person telling me this story, she said, I was there. And I saw those two boys running down the hillside. Sin ropa, sin camisa, sin pantalones, sin calzoncillos, sin medias, sin zapatos, bajando sin la ropa, porque en el Cerro de Tolimán tiene que dar todo o nada. If you enter into the tunnel of the Cerro de Tolimán, if you can't gather all of that treasure at once, you have to leave everything, even the clothes you were wearing. So every spring in El Cerro de Tolimán, every now and then, they see kids running down the hill without any clothes on and without that treasure. If you can figure out a way to gather all of that treasure, you'll get to keep your clothes and that treasure. That is a famous story told in Guanajuato. And if you go to your library, there are a bunch of beautiful books you can find more about these stories. There are amazing Aztec and Mayan stories from Mexico. There are amazing authors that I love. Pam Munoz Ryan is a friend of mine and a beautiful author who has a bunch of beautiful books at the library. There's a wonderful poet I love who's from Nayarit, Francisco Alarcón. He's a friend of mine, and he dedicated this book to me. He is dearly remembered. He passed away about 5 years ago. So those are just a few of the stories I have from my travels through Mexico. And what I wanted to do is spend just a couple of minutes talking about, if you are lucky enough to have friends from Mexico or family from Mexico, or a librarian that can point you to books from Mexico, there is so much you can learn about this beautiful country so close to the United States. And so teachers, I'm just going to spend a few minutes just having some thoughts that you can ask or talk to your kids about. And kids, if you have friends or family from Mexico, these are things you can ask those people about as well. And then I'm going to take some questions in the chat. So you can start putting questions in the chat if you'd like, and Rachel, my producer, will look at them and we'll take a look at it. I'm thrilled to see so many of you here. So here's the thing that I would think about. There's no way to say Mexico is like this, because there are so many different. Rachel, can you mute that one class? Thank you. There are so many different places in Mexico, from like I said, the beaches to the mountains to the volcanoes to the islands to the deserts to the plains. So, but I would say that the one thing that unites Mexico is the food, and many of the regions have a very specific food. So Oaxaca is famous for many things, but its mole is famous in Oaxaca. Veracruz is very famous for a fish a la veracruzana, the way they make that. Mexico City is famous for everything. Guanajuato has its own. So Michoacan is famous for paletas. Michoacan is where they invented the popsicles, these famous popsicles that in Los Angeles, where I live, people are pushing around little carts and they're selling paletas. And it was said that in Mexico, in Michoacan, they were done that. The second thing that unites many Mexicans is their celebrations. So in the United States, many American people in the United States celebrate Dia de Independencia, 4th of July. Mexico has similar celebrations. The three celebrations that I think you're going to find out about from people who are from Mexico is how they celebrate La Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe. That's in December. How they celebrate Dia de los Reyes, the Three Kings Day, in January 6th. And then there's a couple of other amazing celebrations that are specific to states in Mexico. So I would ask friends or family about from Mexico, or if you have them, the kind of food that they eat or that is typical or that they love from their region, their state. I would ask them, what are some of the celebrations they would ask? And the last thing I would say, and this is for a little bit older because the story is a little scary, but 99.9% of the Mexicans I have met have a version of the story of La Llorona. High school kids who are on the Zoom, find the real version of La Llorona and scare the bejangles out of your friends with it. Kids who are younger, ask your uncles or aunties if they're from Mexico the first time they heard about La Llorona. That is the three things: the food, the celebrations, and some of the stories. The last thing I'll say, and this isn't everywhere, but I've heard enough from enough states in Mexico, adivinanzas. There are riddles in Mexico that people love to share. So what I'm going to do now is we have just a few more minutes. I want to honor teachers' times. Teachers, this is going to be recorded, and this is a free Zoom for everybody, but I would love for you to share the recording with any of your teacher friends. And then also let them know that I'll be doing another Zoom in June. We're going to send out information about that on the email, the follow-up email as well. And if you're lucky to be here live, I'm going to see if I can get some of these questions. Let me see. I'm going to look at the chat. There was a question from Miss Trevino's class, one of my favorite places to visit. Miss Trevino, I loved being in your classroom over the years. My favorite place in Mexico. It's so hard to answer that question. I have an amazing memory of being in Playa del Carmen. It is a beach just south of Cancun. And from Playa del Carmen, we went to Chichen Itza and saw that amazing pyramid and heard the story of how once a year on the spring equinox, the snake claws down the pyramid. Not too far from the pyramid are cenotes, where you can go underneath the ground and swim in underwater caverns. And so I would say that Playa del Carmen was my favorite visit, but Guanajuato is where I got all of these stories. So Guanajuato, I think if I had to go to one place in Mexico, it would be Guanajuato. The food, the music, the story, the architecture, the history, that's my favorite place. A lot of amazing questions in the chat. What stories do I recommend for preschool students? Ms. Figueroa and Yolanda and everyone there. So there are so many stories. I think I would leave that to your librarian. Go to your librarian and do that. I have so much studies. There's a story, this book I love, The Corn Woman, which is stories and legends of the Hispanic Southwest. And it sort of ties in the Aztec stories, the Mexican stories, the Spanish stories. This is an old book that is by my bedside all the time. So I think that's one good place. I love the work of all of it. Gary Soto and Sandra Cisneros. There's just amazing books out there now. When I was a kid, they weren't around there. For preschool students, storybooks for preschool students, it's hard for me to say. There's so many really great books coming out now. So I think that would be it. Mr. Trevino, you're welcome. Can you send us a riddle from Mexico, from Natalia? Natalia, I remember. You know what? I will send you a riddle from Mexico. There are plenty of them, which are really great. Here's one small one. I barely remember it. A rooster stood on the top of a barn, and the wind was blowing 15 miles an hour from the east. What side of the barn will the egg that the rooster lays land on? The east side or the west side? And the answer is roosters don't lay eggs. So that is one riddle that I did. Why is Cinco de Mayo on the 5th? That's so interesting. So for those of you who don't know, Cinco de Mayo, cinco is the number 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, cinco, de Mayo, the month of May. There was an amazing battle that happened in the state of Puebla, in the city of Puebla, on the 5th of May. And it was a small number of army that fought a huge number of the army from France. And they won. It was amazing. So that it's celebrated because that's when the battle was won. So that's why it's celebrated on the 5th of May. It is a beautiful celebration of how it's kind of like the way we celebrate the 4th of July. That was the day we were independent. And maybe there was the beginning of that. Ms. Trevino said she loves Guanajuato and she's been in the cenotes too. My favorite dish from Mexico. So Miss Enrique's 4th grade class, it is definitely mole. And it's so funny because mole in Oaxaca was the most exquisite thing I'd ever tasted. Mole in America is awesome. Mole in Oaxaca, it was incredible. That's what I love. I also love the street corn, the street food. Great. La Llorona. I am sorry I did this. La Llorona. We have stories in Cuba, El Cucuy. We have stories in Louisiana, the Hairy Man. We have stories in Chicago, Resurrection Mary. So La Llorona is one of the most famous ghosts from Mexico, and she haunts the rivers. Ooh, where are my children? And people use the story of La Llorona to make the kids behave. Do your homework, or La Llorona will come and get you. Go to sleep, or La Llorona will come and get you. Brush your teeth, or La Llorona will come and get you. There's a whole history of La Llorona. One of my friends wrote her master's thesis, 150 pages about La Llorona. My students want to know if I practice a lot because I don't make any mistakes. Well, you're Miss Juarez and everyone there. It's because I am perfect. No, I practice a lot. I do practice a lot. And some of the stories I've been telling you, I've been thinking about and living with for years. So practice is a huge part. Alvaro de la Cruz. I've never been to Durango, but there's an amazing story about the scorpions from Durango. So if you don't know, look up the scorpions from Durango. There's an amazing song about that as well. And Miguel is yelling at people to stop chatting. Julian, how many stories have I told? Julian, in my life, I can't even count. I've been doing this for 30 years. I tell stories about 200 times a year, so thousands of stories. Nora, I tell stories because I get paid to tell stories. Although today is free, I love telling stories. It's the way I connect with the world. Eleanor, do people speak Spanish in Mexico? Yes, but they also speak a bunch of other languages. In Mexico, you can find every language. Many people in Mexico speak English. Many people speak Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. It's an amazing thing. Oh, Aria, the tunnel in Cerro de Toliman. You know what? I think that is a folk tale. I don't think anyone's actually ever found that tunnel, but it is definitely true that there's gold around those hills. My favorite story, this is the last question in the chat. My favorite story from Mexico. I really do love the Aztec stories, the stories about how the Pyramid of the Sun and the Moon were created. I love the stories of the struggle that Mexicans had against the Spanish and the French. And that's kind of what Cinco de Mayo is all about, how they were able to struggle and eventually triumph and make this beautiful country. You can visit Mexico from your library. You can visit Mexico on the internet. If you are lucky enough to visit Mexico in person, you are going to have stories to tell for many, many years to come. Teachers, thank you for being here live on the Zoom. We're going to send you an email that tells you how you can get a hold of my stuff. I was also on a podcast. This is for teachers. I want to just say this really quickly, specifically talking to teachers, how you can incorporate storytelling in your classroom to teach reading and writing. And there's a podcast where I speak in depth for almost an hour about that. And that's going to be included in the email that we send out to you, so you can check it out. Also, Rachel, my producer, put it in the chat. I'm going to do one more Zoom for this school year in June. We'll send you information about that as well. It's going to be end of the school year, summer stories for you to enjoy. Kiddos, all of my stories are on Spotify and iTunes. You can listen to them for free. I have a bunch of books that you can check out from your library. Teachers, you can figure out how to get in touch with me from the email. High school students, thank you for being here. Students from Horizonte Heights in Texas, thank you for being here. The lab school kids, the LAUSD Mitchell Terrena kids. I'm so lucky to be able to do what I do. Thank you all very much. We'll shut down the Zoom. Look for the link later on, and please share it with your friends. Muchísimas gracias y feliz día de la batalla de Puebla. Happy Cinco de Mayo.